Begin, and Alessia, I'm leaving the admissions to you now. I think I'm just going to start welcoming people. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shireen John, and I'm Communications Coordinator here at LIDC. We're very grateful to have you join us today for this very important debate on racism in the global development sector. I'm shortly going to hand you over to LIDC's Director, Professor Claire Heffernan, who will introduce our speakers and she will chair the discussion. But before I do that, I just wanted to go over some ground rules so that we can make sure that today's event goes smoothly. First of all, I'm going to start by asking you to help us minimize distractions by continuing to keep your cameras and microphones off while speakers are talking. This will really help to minimize the sound quality and distractions. There will be time for questions and answers once the speakers have finished. And when it's time for that, we will ask you to indicate that you want to speak by using the raised hands function in the participants section. And there have been so many Zoom meetings that we're sure you're familiar with that by now. When you are called on to speak, at that point, if you prefer, you can use your camera, and of course we'd like it if you could use your microphone, and if you could also identify yourself, bearing in mind that we are recording this webinar for posting on lidc.ac.uk, our website. We would very much appreciate it if you could perhaps prepare your question ahead of time so that it's brief and pointed, which will give the panel time to address your specific question and allow as many people to speak as possible. Please feel free to live tweet using the hashtag LIDC seminars. We tweet from @LIDC_UK, and those of you who signed up to yesterday would have had an email from us giving you the Twitter handles of all our panels. I have nothing else to add at this point, so with great pleasure, I'm going to thank you again for registering for this seminar. We're very much looking forward to it, and I'm now going to hand you over to Professor Claire Heffernan, our Director.
Thanks very much, Shireen, and welcome everyone. This month's research seminar, and for those of you who are new to LIDC, we are a consortium of 7 University of London institutions, and we facilitate interdisciplinary research events and training in global development. And membership is free for students, staff, and alumni from our member institutions, and certainly please, you can find more information on our website. Now, our seminar series spotlights exciting research and initiatives taking place in global development. We advertise all our seminars on social media, so please do follow us for the latest news. Now, in this webinar, our speakers are going to explore racism and global development. And, you know, global development is founded on this notion of addressing inequalities. Yet many now argue that it represents the problem and not the solution. Now, as part of LIDC's work in social justice and equity, we invite you to join us in this conversation on how much do Black lives matter in global development. And we have invited a group of academics who working in this area who, by all accounts, are considered superstars. And I am, for one, really looking forward to hearing their perspectives on this. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Althea Maria Ribas. She's a lecturer in development studies at SOAS. Her current research focuses on intersectionality, specifically the racialized and gendered nature of aid, post-conflict reconstruction, and social justice. She's worked across a wide variety of areas in global development, from diplomacy to humanitarian assistance to gender and development, with various INGOs and local and international organizations in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. Welcome, Althea.
Thank you, Claire. And thank you for inviting me today. I'm really excited about the discussion as well. So I'll get started because I just have 10 minutes. So today I'm going to make some provocations and then we'll see where it goes from there. So critical scholars, race and development is not necessarily a new topic, right? So critical scholars have traced the colonial origins of development thought, copying its racist tendencies and racialized anxieties onto a post-colonial world. Yet in development studies and policy circles, there's a resounding and loud silence about the entanglements of race, racism, and development. And common assumptions are often made that development takes place in non-racialized spaces and outside of racialized histories. And these silences have obstructed our understanding of the prominence of racialized discourses and practices in development, the embodied experience of racialization for aid workers and intersectionality, and also for the communities and individuals who are the so-called targets of aid, and for those who study development, right? So now the entanglements between race and development are multiple, but today I'm just going to briefly touch on two of those entanglements. Race as an everyday practice in development and race and development studies. So racism is an everyday development practice. The colonial history and legacy upon which international development discourse and practice is built continues to reproduce racialized spaces and to reinforce these asymmetrical power relations in new and complex ways and through everyday encounters. And in so doing, it's established a system of discourse and practices that perpetuate the very inequalities that it aims to address. Meanwhile, the impact of white supremacy becomes more and more entrenched. So Black lives have been fundamental to the story, the justification, and the maintenance of the development industry. Racial hierarchies are maintained and mediated through the imaginaries and the theater of aid, where aid workers seek to soothe the poor and racialized, an act that simultaneously reaffirms their difference and white privilege. And of course, it's not to say that all aid workers are explicitly racist. Some are, of course, right? But there are many aid workers who are dedicated to addressing what are global challenges, such as poverty, violence, and hunger. However, the international aid architecture is fundamentally dependent upon ideas of white supremacy. And therefore, racist behavior and practices not only go unchecked within development, but are the necessary fuel to a project whose life force is dependent upon the idea that capacity, that knowledge, that resources are naturally linked to whiteness, and that those qualities at best can only be introduced or maybe transferred tangentially to others if they've reached the stage of maturity to accept it or acknowledge it. The representations of Blackness as being embodied by poverty and ignorance, and the impunity for racist speech and practices that the international aid architecture affords reassures aid workers of their subject position, while still allowing them to claim a kind of moral superiority, altruism, or awareness. And this allows for action without disruption to notions of white supremacy. So anyone who's worked in aid, if we think about the ways in which capacity building is completely divorced from local contexts, or if you've been an aid worker, the multiple times that you sat in dinner conversations or meetings and heard conversations where shock and dismay are expressed regarding how these people or the locals organize their lives. This is an emotional response which reinforces the necessity of aid workers and their superiority. To disrupt this equation would be fundamentally to undo the structures of aid. And linked to this are the underlying beliefs and related practices that Black bodies can be disposable, sexualized, and devalued. And here we cannot ignore the connections between the death of George Floyd, police brutality, and the structures of white supremacy, which uphold the military industrial aid complex, the private security sector, the impunity of aid workers who commit sexual violence against young Black children. And ultimately, we need to remember that there is no white privilege without Black suffering. Blint and Field suggest that the end of white supremacy would be tantamount to the end of white safety. And so while one can understand intellectually that racism is bad or evil or not something we should aspire to, that may be true, but the destabilization of white supremacy, perhaps for some, is unimaginably worse. Racism in development studies. So within development studies, we see this tradition kind of reproduced, right? And this is accomplished in many different ways, through the negation of different types of knowledge in development studies courses, through the hesitation to engage with issues of race in academic development literature outside of kind of the anthropology of race, and through the lack of diversity of scholars in development studies. So for example, I completed my PhD at what is considered one of the top development institutes in the UK and actually in the world. But I was one of only a handful of Black PhD students in my cohort in that year, and for the 4 years that followed that while I completed the degree. And during that time, I encountered one Black faculty member in the 4 departments and 2 institutes which contributed to development studies. And discussions of race, if they happened at all, were met with great hostility. And indeed, critical development scholars tend to engage quite easily with this global north, global south binary, yet they often begin to roll their eyes, they shift in their chairs, or become very serious once the discussion turns to race. Unless, of course, you allow them to situate themselves as an ally in the room, unless you can cater to that fragility, and unless the critique that you propose is aimed at something outside of the space that you occupy with them. Now, it's not to say that that development studies is absent of anti-racist scholars at all, right? Or those willing to seriously engage with these issues and learn. That would not be true. In fact, I think this year I've met a number of academics who are indeed sincere, engaged, and not turning away from difficult spaces, but it is rare. The whiteness of development studies academic spaces in the UK means that issues of race and racism are rarely centered, or that if they're raised, they can be discussed in a non-threatening and even nurturing space for white fragility. And if by chance you're a Black scholar in that space, you must be aware that your mere presence in their meeting rooms can disrupt that safety, because it doesn't sit neatly with the discourse of white supremacy. So even the focus on equitable partnerships, or research partnerships, while emphasizing some valid aims and necessary changes, doesn't contest the pervasiveness of whiteness or the practices of extraction and exclusion within development studies. Because discussions of more equal partnerships with organizations over there run alongside efforts to protect the whiteness of our ivory towers over here. More development scholars need to reflect upon the ways in which their position is upheld by the structures that they critique. So in conclusion, I just want to take us back to the recent killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Tony McBride, who was a Black transgender man who was killed recently, that have sparked protests around the world that reflect, I think, anger, but also hope. So this moment has in many ways forced a conversation on race, on Black lives, and enduring forms of everyday and structural violence. The change, of course, will come with continued organization and mobilization, but it is a powerful moment. And there is an opportunity here for the development sector and development studies to create platforms in which to speak about race and racism, to develop new research agendas which will allow us to interrogate these issues, and which go beyond a critique of development institutions and structures, but decenter Europe and center Black, Asian, Latin American, and African social and political thought to rethink development not as assistance or help or, God forbid, charity, which is the one I dislike the most, but through a lens of justice, perhaps reparative justice, or perhaps as Bayesian scholar Anthony Lane suggested in the 1970s when he wrote of development not as being confined to the promotion of economic growth, but as a struggle for social justice. And this is long before we begin to talk about human development and aspirations. But I wonder if that will happen, because white supremacy and racialized hierarchies of power were central to the colonial project, and they are also fundamental to the international development architecture, to the international development discourse and practices, and to the modes of knowledge production within development policy and scholarship. So to end, as Baldwin says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And ultimately, the development industry and development scholars may not be ready to face development's history and the continued entanglements with race, racism, and white supremacy that characterized the industry and academia. And unless this happens, the silences that I spoke of at the beginning of my talk will continue to persist. Thank you.
Okay, Althea, thank you so much for that. Incredibly powerful. Okay, now I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments and questions at the end. Our next speaker is Dr. Robtel Nijay Paley, and she's a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at Oxford's Department of International Development, and her fellowship focuses on race, citizenship, South-South migration, and development cooperation in Liberia and Sierra Leone. She has wide research interests across the political economy of development, migration, conflict, post-war recovery and governments, and previously she was an Ibrahim Leadership Fellow at the African Development Bank. Welcome, Robtel.
Thank you so much. Thank you to LIDC for the invitation. I feel almost like an imposter because I think I'm the only non-London-based university affiliate. So I thank you for allowing me to infiltrate the discussion. I'd also like to thank my Sierra Leonean sister, Shireen John, for all of her heavy lifting and organizing. You've been phenomenal throughout this entire process. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to divide my interventions into two parts. The first part will focus on my exploration of how anti-Black racism actually manifests in global development. And then secondly, I'd like to speak most importantly about how we can actually tackle this. So I'd like to thank Althea for helping to frame the discussion in this way. So I'll start with a premise, which is a bit of a paradox, right? So while global development purports to liberate Black people from structural inequalities born by slavery, colonialism, neoliberalism, development scholarship, policies, and practice actually exploit, silence, and infantilize Black people. Now, in terms of my part one, I'm going to start with a premise that development suffers from what I call a white gaze problem. This is a phrase that I used in a Development Studies Association conference keynote that I gave last year at Open University, and also something that became a development and change article entitled Decentering the White Gaze of Development. So what is the white gaze of development effectively? It's borrowed from the work of Black literary icons and intellectuals such as Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, et cetera, who really challenged one-dimensional racist tropes about Blacks in America. Now, the white gaze of development is the assumption that Western whiteness and modernity are the primary signifiers of progress, against which all others, Black people and people of color in general, are deemed deviant, inferior, and incomplete. Now, the white gaze of development facilitates what a sister of mine, a Sierra Leonean or Senegalese sister of mine by the name of Amy Nyang, who's a international relations scholar based at the University of Wits, she and I called the structural dismissal of Black life. Now, this is a phrase that we use in an article that was published in the Nation magazine a couple of weeks ago, in which we argue that US militarization in Africa is really an outward expression of anti-Black policing in the United States. So I can see this structural dismissal of Black life in development in three fundamental ways. The first is the instrumentalization of Black suffering. So when development institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF insist, on one hand, that African countries, for instance, cut social spending and health to be eligible for debt cancellation, and then on the other hand, use Ebola or COVID-19 as a pretext for external white intervention. Secondly, the brutalization of Black bodies. I'll go back to the example of US militarization in Africa. So the tragic irony of the US military indiscriminately dropping bombs on Somalia, for instance, and then murdering innocent civilians, while on the other hand, authorizing food aid for the same country. Number three, the disdain for Black expertise. Now, while white Westerners in the so-called global North continue to control the levers of power of development, you see the paying of so-called local staff in majority Black countries, a small fraction of what so-called white foreign experts, quote unquote, might make, or the unwillingness to hire progressive Black faculty in international development departments across the globe, especially those Black scholars who have critical race ideologies or who challenge racism in the discipline. Now I'm going to shift focus on part two of the discussion. How do we tackle the structural dismissal of Black life? How do we tackle this white gaze of development? And how do we tackle the anti-Black racism in the sector? I have 8 specific suggestions for a call to action. The first is the importance of mainstreaming race as an anti-racist agenda for development, in the same way that Marxist and feminist scholars have mainstreamed class and gender respectively. Now, analyzing race forces us to see development, in quotation marks, as a global challenge, right? Not only a predicament of the so-called global South. So for example, Black people in the global North and the global South experience limited statehood. They experience material deprivation. They experience grinding poverty and inequality. Again, in the so-called global South, as much as they do in the so-called global North, at alarming rates, right? So COVID-19 is a primary example of how Blackness can be seen or considered a pre-existing condition for structural inequalities. 2, I think it's important to take cue from the Black Lives Matter demands. If you haven't read those demands, I think you should get online and read them immediately. Now, the movement for Black Lives is calling for radical redistribution of resources, as well as reparations. So everything from defunding to divestment, removing funds from policing into Black communities that have been at the receiving end of anti-Black police violence. Now, what would this look like at a global scale, and in particular in global development? I think thirdly, we need to recognize that aid is not altruistic, it is strategic. It always serves the interests of the so-called quote unquote donor. Now, that the lion's share of development funding gets channeled through international organizations is not by accident, it's by design, deliberate design. Now, if this were challenged, it would put a lot of white development workers out of jobs. Instead, what we should be thinking about is channeling the lion's share of aid to local organizations that actually have a track record of delivering public goods in their own context. I think the fourth thing that I think we should consider is that public relations schemes by development institutions, which announce large aid pledges to majority Black countries, all countries for that matter, should be completely discredited and condemned. Instead, we should be announcing disbursements with details about which institutions are actually getting the disbursements and for what purpose. Now, I'd like to use the edict of my former boss and the first African woman elected head of state, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who often challenged donors to what she called shorten the road between commitment and cash. Now, aid figures are deliberately opaque, right? They create crises in majority Black countries because citizens often assume that their governments are getting significantly more in aid than they actually are. Now, what we need to do is make aid less of a charade in that respect. Number 5, I think it's important beyond the aid discussion is to really shift the focus from aid to reparations. What would reparations look like for slavery, colonialism, imperialism at a global scale? Now, debt cancellation without conditionalities may be one example of this. There's an ongoing discussion in the United States, particularly about reparations. Now, this should be front and center in development policy, scholarly, and public discourse. Number 6, I think it's absolutely essential that we dismantle the system of racist, unequal remuneration in development. Why do so-called white expatriate workers get paid excessively compared to their so-called local Black counterparts? We should be paying people according to their contextual expertise, not their passports or the color of their skin. Furthermore, I think hiring practices should be about rupture, not tokenism or maintaining the status quo by just hiring more Black people. If you hire Black people who reproduce the same problematic racist tropes, policies, and practices, this perpetuates the system of anti-Blackness. Number 7, I think it's important and essential for us to read, acknowledge, and reference the work of radical Black thinkers who have challenged the pervasive nature of anti-Blackness in development in other sectors, long before this particular contemporary moment. 2 examples come to mind. The first is Cedric Robinson's seminal, very, very important text, Black Marxism, in which he coined the term racial capitalism. This is basically, while global domination and structural inequalities are constituted by economic power, it's reinforced or justified by racial power. Another Black radical thinker I think is important for us to reference, read, and acknowledge is Charles W. Mills. His book, The Racial Contract, is incredibly important in terms of these kinds of discussions. He argues that unlike the social contract, the racial contract is a political, economic, and social system that actually reinforces what he calls global white supremacy. I think last but certainly not least, we need to move beyond anti-racist solidarity statements. Now, I've become increasingly cynical about these anti-racist solidarity statements. I think in most cases, I find them to be incredibly disingenuous, insincere, and performative. I think instead, what we should be focusing on is strategizing and making concrete plans for addressing the anti-Black racism in development within our institutions, right? So be they multilateral development institutions, UN agencies, NGOs, or even university international development or development studies departments. Now, how will we monitor progress and hold ourselves accountable is what I think we should be considering. Last but certainly not least is a question that I always ask us in this sector who are interested in and invested in structural transformation as well as social justice. how are we decentering the white gaze of development in our work at individual level, but also institutional level? I'll end there. Thank you again for allowing me to intervene.
Okay, thank you, Ramtal. That was absolutely great. Thank you for that. Finally, I'd like to welcome our last speaker, Kalpana Wilson. And Kalpana is a lecturer in geography at Birkbeck, and her research explores questions of race, gender, labor, neoliberalism, reproductive rights and justice, with a particular focus on South Asia and its diaspora. She is the author of Race, Racism and Development, Interrogating History, Discourse and Practice, and she's published widely on race, gender, international development, women's agencies, and rural labor movements. Welcome, Kalpana.
Thank you, Claire. And I'd like to start off by thanking LIDC and in particular thanking Shireen, John, for all the work of organizing and conceptualizing this really important and really timely event, drawing inspiration from the Black Lives Matter movement. I think echoing something which Althea said, we need to ask ourselves, though, why talking about racism and development is still a matter of breaking silences. Why, when we talk about racism and development, we are told at best that it is eye-opening. Why it's still somehow novel to be talking about racism. One reason, of course, and I think both Althea and Robtel have already brilliantly explored this, is the overwhelming whiteness of development and development organizations. And another related reason, I think, is the refusal to see racism as something which operates globally, and Robtel has also touched on this. So even those who recognize the centrality of racism to social formations like the US, or the UK, or South Africa, or Brazil, for example, still refuse to see it beyond those particular racialized societies. They refuse to see it as something which structures global inequalities and patterns of exploitation and accumulation within which development is embedded. So racism in development is seen as a new thing to be talking about in 2020. And this is despite the fact that it's now almost a century since W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about the global color line. And it's almost 50 years since the Guyanese Marxist scholar and activist Walter Rodney wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which brilliantly explains how the whole edifice of European capitalism was built on the profits of Atlantic slavery and colonialism. And I think it's a book which everyone working in development in any way should read, because it also explains how these processes were inextricable from extraction and impoverishment, destruction of diverse livelihoods, thriving cities and industries across Africa. Now, what's particularly inspiring, I think, about the Black Lives Matter protests going on at the moment is that they are making these connections in practice. So in Britain, the targeting of statues of slave traders like Edward Colston in Bristol and colonial white supremacists like Rhodes and Churchill reflects that this movement is linking murderous police racism in North America, the UK, and Europe with how the violence of race and white supremacy has been historically and remains today embedded in global structures of capital accumulation. Because as we've heard, when we look at how racism shapes development, we are not only talking of colonial legacies, important though it is to recognize these. We're also looking at ongoing contemporary material processes and structures. Development interventions operate to continue the transfer of resources to the global north on a massive scale. Right now, for example, we're in the midst of a new wave of colonialism with corporate land grab and extraction of people's labor and resources from Africa. One way this has been happening is through global development initiatives like the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition and the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. In the name of fighting hunger and promoting so-called climate smart agriculture,
They're forcibly transferring land to corporates for export crops like palm oil and biofuels, once again using the racist colonial myths of the land as empty. They're compelling changes to seed laws, which mean that indigenous agricultural knowledge is both criminalized and appropriated. They're requiring the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which cause harms amounting to slow death. At the same time, the people being targeted for this plunder of their land, labor, and knowledge continue to be represented through colonial racialized tropes as the perpetual recipients of aid from Britain and the West. So I was listening again to Boris Johnson's speech about the scrapping of DFID. And like so much of what he says, of course, it was overtly racist in the way he chose to refer to two African countries, Zambia and Tanzania, to represent the supposedly undeserving among aid recipients. But it was also deeply ironic when both of these countries not only experienced decades of British colonial plunder, but are the key targets, among other countries, of these current initiatives of takeover of agricultural land by British corporates and the transfer of resources and profits on a massive scale. And this is facing intense resistance from people's movements. Now, one thing which is very striking about the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK is that if you look at the people who are being remembered in those protests, there's a particular focus on the violence of borders. Among the people whose names are being remembered are those of Joy Gardner, who was murdered in front of her 5-year-old son by police and immigration officials who had come to deport her to Jamaica. There is Jimu Mubenga, who was murdered by the private security company G4S while on a plane being deported to Angola. And there are the many who died as a result of the Windrush scandal. So when we think about this question, which is being posed today, do Black Lives Matter in development? We need to think about how development now is explicitly geared to shoring up these borders, which repeatedly kill, to containing people within the global South, preventing people from moving, while allowing resources and profits to freely move to the global North. Now, in the UK, this approach was crystallized as the development security paradigm under Tony Blair. So I think we need to ask some questions when we look at the recent changes, because we can't assume that British aid is only now being linked to British economic interests. It's been the case right from the outset. And more generally, many people have demonstrated, both scholars and activists, how sustainable development is about sustaining massive racialized global inequalities. And I think in particular, we need to look at how Malthusian and eugenicist ideologies continue to underpin so much of development policy, particularly, of course, around population policies. And again, the goal of population policy, and this has been explicitly stated by successive UK governments, is to contain populations, to prevent migration, and to facilitate further slashing of social spending in the global South. Population policies at the moment are also shaped by a combination of the so-called philanthrocapitalists, especially the Gates Foundation, and pharmaceutical corporations. And they're based on a devaluing of Black lives, in which racialized women and adolescent girls are understood as dangerous reproductive bodies marked by supposedly excessive fertility, which needs to be managed and controlled. So currently, through development initiatives like FP 2020, which of course has been renamed FP 2030 recently, which are promoted in the name of reproductive rights, women in Africa and Asia are pushed to adopt long-acting hormonal contraceptives in conditions where they have no access to the medical follow-up required for these to be safe in any way. And in some contexts are also facing coercive mass sterilizations. They're facing the unsafe testing of contraceptives, most recently in 2017 with the ECHO trials for Depo-Provera in 4 African countries. So these are some of many forms of often fatal embodied racialized violence in development, which are also always gendered. And I think we need to ask what reproductive justice, a term which was developed by Black feminists in the US, but like many others, I'm seeing is being appropriated and changed in its meaning by the development sector. What does reproductive justice actually mean for women who are the targets of these policies? And how are these policies being resisted? Now, one thing I'm sometimes asked as someone who works on India is that Indian capital is increasingly significant in the global economy. So what does this mean in terms of global capital accumulation as a racialized system, which I've been talking about? Now, during the recent Black Lives Matter protests and the ongoing movement in Britain, I've seen a lot of South Asian people coming out in solidarity. Now, on the one hand, this is in recognition of the specific shared history we have in Britain of organizing together against racism. But there's also been a recognition and challenging of pervasive anti-Black racism in South Asian communities, which has been very important. And it's particularly important to talk about this now, because currently this anti-Black racism, which is both deeply colonial in origin and also rooted in South Asia's own much longer dehumanizing hierarchy of caste, this is being intensified by the far-right Modi government in India and its Hindu supremacist ideology. Now, this ideology, of course, also dehumanizes poor people in India itself, who are largely Dalit, oppressed caste from Adivasi or indigenous communities or Muslim, and who do not in any way benefit from the fact that Indian billionaire capitalists have been incorporated into the highest echelons of the global capitalist system. So I'd argue that this process only reinforces racism in the system and in fact adds new dimensions to it. Now, finally, before I finish, I wanted to say that one of the central ways that development perpetuates racism globally is that it renders invisible everything which happens outside of the structures of development in the global South. And yet it's outside of these structures of so-called partnership in political and social movements across continents that these racialized structures of global capital accumulation are being resisted. And as in the Black Lives Matter movement, other kinds of worlds are being envisioned and fought for. And it is these movements and their demands which we need to listen to now. Thank you.
Kalpana, thank you so much for that. That was amazing. And now I think we're going to open the audience, open questions up to the audience. So do we have any hands raised, Shireen?
Sorry, if I could just remind everyone, if you wish to speak, please do raise your hand in the participant section of the chat. We have a question from Natasha Lewis. Natasha, if you'd like to turn your mic on and also your camera, if you're happy with that.
Sure. I don't think I can turn my video on at the moment, but I've got my mic on. I'd just like to thank all of the speakers and also the facilitators and organizers of the discussion. It's been really enriching so far. I sort of asked my question in the chat, and I have to kind of add a proviso that I'm not coming at a place of outside criticism, but we often kind of privilege and center universities and university education in the global north. And similarly, development practitioners who are based in the global north, in places like London. And I'm saying this as someone that I work for a big INGO. My job is based in London. I also went to a London university to do my master's, which then enabled me to work in this sector. But I just have a question about how do we then, within the sector also build up not just capacity, but leadership and agency, expertise, and recognize that within the global South, whether it is in university faculties in the global South, in countries where we come from. I mean, I'm Indian, and you know, I didn't go to an Indian university to do my master's. I came here to London. So I have a question about that. How do we also do that with our own organizations? The INGO that I work for is very sort of US and I guess Europe centric, even though obviously most of the countries we work in, most of our staff are in Asia and Africa and Latin America and some in the Pacific. So I guess it's about reshifting centers of power. Thanks.
So who would like to take Natasha's question in turn, maybe? Althea, in the start?
Yeah, I mean, I have two quick suggestions. I think one of the things that is difficult with research funding, for example, is that Global South universities or Southern partners are always at a disadvantage, right? So they're always like co-investigators. There's very strict regulations about how much funding can go to them. And even in the kind of new wave of funding that focuses, like I said in my talk, on equitable partnerships, the percentage of the funding that actually goes to them is very small. So they're never really seen as being equal partners, just a little bit more equal. But I think research projects or research funding that stipulates that universities or researchers in the Global South should be the lead and in these projects, in conceptualizing them, and then they can partner with universities elsewhere to get support, whatever support they need, but it's about conceptualizing their own projects. That is something very important that I would like to see. So, you know, centering knowledge from other places as opposed to allowing them to kind of build or grow from the knowledge that comes from Western universities. And also funding for things like PhD programs. So, you know, investing in a new generation of scholars who are able to engage with innovative thinking. So not just training them to use development frameworks effectively or to improve development frameworks or to be staff at the World Bank through internship or placement programs, right? But really centering the knowledge that can come and it already exists within different spaces.
Can
I jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think one of the fundamental ways of decentering these power imbalances is to decentralize funding. So instead of centering funding at a UK-based university, that funding should be centered at maybe a Liberian-based university or a Gambian-based university or a South African-based university, and allowing those institutions to determine how they will actually use the funding, right? And this could be through grant proposals with so-called global North institutions and so-called global South institutions, or they could be directly coming from global South institutions. And this also goes for development funding in terms of development practice. So I mentioned something about making sure that the lion's share of so-called aid is channeled to local institutions that actually have a track record of delivering public goods. I think that's one of the ways of decentering these power asymmetries.
Kalpana, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything that's already been said in terms of research funding, which in a way is the whole structural issue which underpins this inequality. But I think on top of that as well, I think individual scholars in development have a responsibility in their practice, which is extremely racialized. I mean, you know, a very large proportion of these scholars who basically depend on researchers in the Global South for their work, but very often, you know, they won't be, for example, you know, co-authors on publications, or they will always be the second author, even though it's actually their work which is being represented. And, you know, I've heard a great deal of racism actually very explicitly in terms of the kinds of reasons which are given for these sorts of practices. So I think there is that responsibility as well to just stop doing that. And I think that's also important.
Can I just have a quick comment? And this is going to be somewhat flies in the face of it. I sit on many, many research panels, many across a variety of funding boards. And I would say 10 years ago, that was absolutely true. This focus on the Global South wasn't there. It was completely and utterly dominated by Northern institutions. That is starting to shift. There is a much more sense about these panels, about what an equitable partnership looks like. And in the old days, you know, this kind of the way that people would set up these partnerships, of course, it was completely and utterly unequal, and there was no thought given to Southern partners. And thankfully, that is starting to shift. Is it shifting fast enough? No. Could we do a lot more work in this area? Absolutely.
Right. Thank you very much for that. We have a question from Chris Lowe, which he's put in the chat, so I shall read it out. He says the question is to Kalpana Wilson: is it useful to talk about racism in the Indian context, or is it more appropriate to talk about internal colonialism against Dalits, Adivasis? And the next question after that will be from Shannon Phillips. So if Kalpana would like to address Chris's question first, please.
Okay. Also wanted to just maybe highlight the point from Grace in the chat, which says that things are starting to shift because people have made noise about it, specifically people from the global South. And I think that's really important. Completely agree with that. About Chris's question, is it useful to talk about racism in the Indian context? I think it absolutely is. When we look at, for example, you know, some of the things which have happened over the last few years, like the attacks on African students, which took place in Delhi, for example, we have to recognize that this is racism, and it's very much rooted, as I said, both in colonial ideas as well as in notions of caste. It's also the fact that we can see how you know, the ideas of the Hindu right, which are very much rooted in Islamophobia and demonization of Muslims, kind of fit in with some of the relatively kind of recently dominant elements within global racialization, where you have, you know, Islamophobia becoming increasingly very, very significant. So we do need to look at this both at the level of India and at the global level. Personally, I don't think in terms of internal colonialism, but rather in terms of the way caste operates in relation to Dalits and Adivasis. But I think that's a whole different debate. I mean, I would think of colonialism in the Indian context really primarily in relation to Kashmir. But those are, as I said, you know, quite long discussions, which perhaps we could have another time.
Thank you very much. Shannon Phillip, I am going to ask you to unmute yourself and use your camera if you'd like to ask your question now, please. Don't have to use your camera, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, no, thank you to all the panelists. My question was actually to Proctel, and I found the whole presentation and the panel really quite fascinating. It was about the wide gaze of development, and this sort of very fantastic and useful concept to think about. And I was thinking about it in light of Kalpana's comments in terms of sort of brown capital, for example. You know, and I was wondering whether sort of instead of, so how do we critically thinking about the sort of wide gaze of development, but using brown capital? You know, is it still just a white gaze, or is it actually brown capital, a brown gaze, a black gaze that's somehow intrinsically built around capital, and from white perhaps it's changing form into these other forms of capital accumulation that are exploitative? Or do you think there's something particularly racialized that's maybe working in and through that? So I just thought that question.
Thank you for your question. So I framed my discussion around the white gaze of development within the context of anti-Black racism because of the question we were asked to answer with this very specific panel. But the white gaze of development is about measuring whiteness as the model, the signifier of progress, against which all others. So that's brown people, that's Black people, that's non-white people in general, right? People of color in general. And I often look at the work of Kalpana and also Cedric Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, whose book, Black Marxism, I think is a read that all of us should be engaging with. In which they really argue that while global domination or global white supremacy is constituted by economic power, like capital moving from one part of the globe to another, it's constituted by racialized power. And I keep going back to that argument over and over again, because I think it's fundamentally true. And if you link that to Charles W. Mills's notion of global white supremacy or the racial contract, they're very, very much aligned and intertwined with that particular argument around economic power being the basis for global white supremacy, but it being constituted and then reinforced by the sort of racial power. And that's white racial power specifically.
Thank you very much for that. I think the next question is from Sheila Mburu. Sheila, would you like to go ahead and ask your question, please? You can use your mic and camera.
Hi, Shireen. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not able to put on my camera. But my question was really, it was interesting to hear the discussions around changes to funding practices. But I guess I was thinking sort of in addition to and beyond changing practices and funding, what other practical ways could research partnerships aim towards genuine equity, especially thinking about kind of notions of superiority and inferiority that exist between the different actors involved in international partnerships? Sorry, I hope you heard that.
Yeah, does anybody want to take that?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in just very briefly, and I'll say that one of the things that I find to be really problematic about development research in general is how extractivist it is. So it's about extracting information, it's about extracting knowledge, it's about extracting expertise from the so-called global south and then taking it to the global north and using that knowledge, that expertise or that information to then make a name for yourself as a scholar, right? Without acknowledging the work, the labor, the intellectual integrity of the people in the so-called global south. So I think one of the things that we can do as development scholars, as development policymakers or practitioners is thinking about how to stop that extractivism from taking place, right? So how do we keep that knowledge, that expertise, and that intellectual integrity back in the countries in which we've taken the information? I think one of the ways that we can do that is once the information is then so-called extracted, how do we bring it back, right? How do we, again, co-publish with people who we've worked with in terms of being local partners? How do we make sure that we acknowledge them in the publications that we then go on to do? How do we make sure that they're lead authors in the articles that we write? And then how do we take that knowledge back? So one of the things that I do ultimately is when I write information or when I do research on Liberia, I make sure that the very first place that I present my findings is Liberia. I don't go to the University of Oxford and present my findings there first, because that knowledge, that expertise, that information is fundamentally important to Liberia's socioeconomic transformation. And so I take that back to the policymakers, I take that back to co-scholars, I take that back to co-practitioners, and we have a discussion about how that can actually transform the country in which the information is coming from. So changing the extractive nature of knowledge, I think is absolutely important. And how we do that in different ways, it really depends on the sector in which we work or how we intend to tackle that.
Yeah, I agree with what Rob Teller said. Those are important things. And I think one of the things that would be really useful is thinking about how we then ensure that this happens through changing our research frameworks, right? And the kind of grant application processes or the ways that the research councils work. Because you can do that as, like Rob Teller said, as an individual scholar, right? You can make a commitment, and that's kind of attached to your political and kind of research profile and the things that you invest in, right, as a critical race scholar. But I think we need to also think more broadly about how we ensure that this doesn't happen as a wider practice, which is something that's kind of characterized development studies and policy circles, right? And one of the things is to make sure that you don't get funding unless you are able to meet certain, I don't want to use the word targets, but unless you do certain things. So a lot of these questions for me are around ethics. It's the ethics of research, right? So perhaps there should be, ethical research statements that are co-produced that you need to submit when you apply for funding, for example, right? That have to be done jointly with the partners, where you make plans and commitments regarding things like not just what you're going to produce, so what are the research outputs going to be, but who's going to be involved in that, right? So who's going to receive authorship, right? Who's going to be acknowledged in that, right? What are the plans for communication and dissemination, and how do they then involve the communities and the organizations that you work with themselves, right? What do they want out of this? So making those questions that are sometimes kind of left until the end, right? Or just incorporating in grants in a very kind of tangential way, fundamental to the application and the thinking through of the research before anything gets funded, right? So I think there has to be a rethinking of the limitations and the requirements to get funding if anything is going to change, because otherwise people will just continue to write interesting proposals and say they're going to do things, but the extractive nature of research itself won't shift.
I mean, thank you for that. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, research is by its nature extractive. So it becomes a much wider kind of debate. How do you prevent that? And I think in terms of, if you wanted to very quickly address the power structures almost tomorrow, you would just make all the money, the division of the money equal. There's no one university or topic or, researcher that gets, there's no prime institution. It would be shared between institutions equally. But, we've got a ways to go before we get there. But yeah, thank you for that. Are there any other questions?
Well, equal share, just to jump in, equal sharing wouldn't really create equality given the huge imbalance we already have.
Absolutely, but where do you start?
Talking in terms of reparative approaches here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But this is something when you lead big projects that you do think about the ethics of this. How do you promote early career researchers? How do you ensure that your Southern partners have a voice and an equal voice? I mean, it is something that, that we all have to think about. Do we do it well enough? No, absolutely not. So is there any other questions that have come out of the?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
We have an in-person question from Helena Hurd, who I'm going to ask to speak next. Before that, I should let you know that we are going to wrap up the questions after the next few whose names I'm going to read out, because if they all get a chance to ask their questions, we will in fact then have run out of time. There are some written questions also to follow from Nana Oto-Oyote, Natasha Wimanzi, Emily Gillingham, and Sophie Efange. So Sophie Efange is actually in person. So I think after Sophie's question, we will ask you, Claire, if that's okay to sum up. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over now to Helena Hurd, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and if you prefer, use your camera.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Just wanted to thank the panelists again for a really interesting discussion. I wanted to ask what the panelists felt about the localization agenda, because I think that sometimes that's used as a way to counter these problems, but I think that in itself it's quite problematic, and I've been looking at it more critically in recent months. So I was wondering if they had any thoughts specific to that. Thanks.
Does somebody want to take that, Helena's question?
Maybe I'll ask Helena what she means by problematic. What makes localization problematic?
I think that the discourse seemed a little bit troubling. I read an interesting article by Christina Ruppsdorf that said that we need to critically reflect on how the localization discourse is used to sort of reinforce ideas of othering rather than sort of cooperation, and how it often is brought in towards the end of the process. So I would be interested in whether you are seeing it being used usefully, or whether you are seeing some of those problems.
Yeah, if I can make a few comments about that. Yeah, I think the localization agenda, it's become intensified or quite popular after the World Humanitarian Summit, right, in 2016, where there were specific commitments made to investing in local organizations and diversifying knowledge. But one of the problems I see with the way it's kind of unfolded is it's really focused on partnerships, right? And those partnerships are fundamentally based on particular extractive practices, but problematic practices. So who even becomes a partner or is seen to be eligible to be a local partner is based on organizations that are able to reflect kind of what a Western aid organization looks like, right? So organizations that have a lot of staff that speak English or have particular kind of reporting processes, right, that are able to feed into the development industry as it is already. Not necessarily organizations that are recognized or needed by local communities themselves, right? So it's only a particular type of organization that is deemed worthy of increased funding through the localization agenda. And also it's something that I mentioned in my talk just briefly is the way that capacity building is discussed, or the discourse around capacity building and localization agenda. So it's still framed around the idea that more capacity needs to be transferred to local actors. But that assessment of capacity or needs is always based on the idea that there's a lack of capacity in local organizations, and that capacity itself is defined by kind of Western standards, right? It's rarely do we see a needs assessment or capacity assessment done of the lack of capacity of Western aid actors, right? So the localization agenda says that it wants to invest in local organizations, but those that reflect the West and those that can build capacity as defined by the aid architecture itself. So it kind of completely misses the idea that actually local knowledge is contextual and it's important and it needs to be centered. And of course, there's also the whole discourse around the transfer of risk to local organizations in conflict-affected areas, right? So why are we localizing? Is it just because development actors don't want to absorb the risk that is then transferred onto local organizations without any kind of protections? So in many ways, localization seems like a good thing, but it's very problematic.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say I wasn't aware of the whole localization agenda when I was making my comments. My comments were just basically what I've observed as someone who's worked in the quote unquote development sector as a practitioner. But I think one of the ways to address this discourse is to think about who actually exercises public authority in these different places and spaces. Not necessarily people who represent a particular Western kind of configuration, but who actually has trust of communities, who actually is legitimate in the eyes of communities, and doing a whole audit around that. And then investing in those institutions, not because they happen to reflect Western configurations of power, but because they actually have the trust and the legitimacy in communities that would actually use their services. And then again, going back to who has actually delivered public goods and has received legitimacy and public authority because of their ability to deliver public goods. I think that would probably help address some of these power imbalances within the localization agenda or the localization discourse.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that very briefly, I agree. I think that there are a lot of problematic assumptions around this whole notion of localization, which basically because who has to kind of prove that they are local and who gets to be universal, I think is also a question which has really dogged development all through, which is, it's very racialized, the white position that is assumed to be the global position, the universal one, and everybody else has to prove their local credentials, as it were. And I think the localization agenda also links up very much to this whole, something which has been happening really since the advent of good governance, where you get development organizations really coming in and bypassing all the democratic structures which may or may not have accountability, as Rochelle said, and then kind of seeking out and identifying and legitimizing who gets to be the representative of the local. And I think that's hugely problematic.
Thank you very much for that. I think Nana Oyote's question has perhaps already been referred to by the speakers, but it's probably not for me to judge, so I'm going to go ahead and read it out. Nana says, very insightful presentations. My question is to the speakers. It's on the issue of equity in access and use of research knowledge to inform development practice. Research conducted in development countries is often not disseminated in the South and fails to inform development practice. To whose benefit is this research often funded by the West? Would any of the speakers like to comment on that, or shall I move on to the next question from Natasha Imanzi?
I think we addressed it. I mean, Althea talked about, you know, funding structures. I talked about the fact that we have a responsibility, and then, you know, Althea kind of expanded it and said this should be at the institutional level, where we have a responsibility, again, to be accountable to the communities where we worked or the information that we've extracted that information from. So in terms of research ethics, I think we sort of addressed that already.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So I'll move on to Natasha Uimanzi's question, which is for Althea Rivers and Rob Tell. Her question is, what are the opportunities available to encourage African academics and students to engage and produce more research, given that these spaces were previously closed to us and are now opening up more? How do we rise to the playing field and fill these spaces once the space on the table has been availed? And how do we go about strengthening and propagating our own perspectives on knowledge construction?
Ooh, that's a really big question to ask at the end. I think one of the things that I think needs to shift is the funding structures that exist in African countries, right? There are very few African countries that actually fund state universities, and more than that, fund development institutions or development departments within state universities. My university, or the University of Liberia, where I worked formerly, receives a huge stipend or huge subsidies from the Liberian government. But there have been calls to scratch that funding, right? That 1% subsidy that we receive from the Liberian government by multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. And so I think states often see universities in the continent of Africa as a threat, because they will challenge the status quo if they're funded properly. Scholars who don't have to run behind consultancies to make a living will be able to think and to produce knowledge that, again, talks about structural transformation in the continent. So I think we need to challenge our states to make sure that we're funding and supporting institutions, universities, that are going to produce the next leaders in development scholarship, that are going to produce the next leaders in development policy and practice. And then beyond that, if you have access to so-called global north institutions, the responsibility, again, is to go back and serve. So one of the things that I've been doing more increasingly, and I hope this becomes an institutional kind of practice, is I spend my summers teaching at the University of Liberia pro bono, because I know that even though I'm based in the UK and in London, that I have a responsibility to my country and my continent. And that's the way that I think I can serve in that way.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the last written question that we have time for, and then there'll be one more question after that, which will be from Sophie Fange. So Sophie, your question will be the last one of the webinar today. I'm going to read out now Emily Gillingham's question, which is, how do you see the role of public fundraising, and do you see it as possible to decenter the white gaze in this area? What do you think it will take to shift the narrative from charity, stroke helping, stroke giving, to giving back, stroke reparations, stroke solidarity? And do you see this as a desirable direction for just reframing the same problem? And on a personal note, I apologize for any background noise that you might hear from my side. Thank you.
I would really like to see a conversation on some of the things that we talked about today, you know, on race and racism and white supremacy in philanthropic gift giving. within the sector. And I think that would be a really good way to kind of open up not just conversation, but to think about how things can change, because more and more funding is coming from private foundations, from the public. And I think there's a need to kind of create awareness as to how central kind of representations of Blackness and poverty are to those kind of incentives, right, or desires to give. So I think a conversation actually would be the starting point, because that's one area that, you know, it really hasn't, these things haven't happened. And it's one area that kind of grows from this white altruism.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to this, I think it's a really important question, because I mean, one of the things we've seen over the past decade or so is this shift in some of the fundraising to a notion of, you know, shifting representations and this attempt to produce kind of positive images in a lot of the charity sector. Of course, we still have all the colonial images we had before of, you know, particularly children, sometimes women, being represented as, you know, basically in need of help. But now we have these other representations which are like, you know, women who are, you know, have agency and who are basically entrepreneurial, and also sometimes very young, well, adolescent girls who are also children, again, being represented as incredibly productive. And I think we need to look at how those images also are extremely racialized, and the way they draw on, you know, notions of differential capacities for labor, you know, because you're having this idea that when it's an adolescent girl, a child in the global South, her being entrepreneurial and somehow, you know, taking up a small business to support her family is actually something we should be celebrating. And this draws on, you know, ideas which have been talked about by Black feminists, you know, Bell Hooks, you know, going back to Sojourner Truth, you know, this notion that, you know, Black women have this sort of tremendous capacity for labor, which white women don't. And I think these are the kinds of questions that need to be asked if there is, you know, shifts in what's happening with public representations.
One of the things I'd like to see more of is an engagement or some sort of juxtaposition between diasporic philanthropy and non-diasporic philanthropy, or the sort of rise in Black philanthrocapitalists like you know, Tony Alumelu or Amo Ibrahim, and how their, you know, philanthropy might be slightly different from other different types of philanthropy that are not African in orientation. So I think that sort of juxtaposition, that comparing and contrasting, might be an interesting research agenda that we follow through on.
Okay, that's great. Shireen, I think we're going to have to wrap up now.
We have one last question, which we had promised the speaker she could deliver. So Sophie, you now have the wonderful task of having to make your question very brief and pointed so that we can start wrapping up. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. I will keep my comment very short. So my question comes back to the point, Robtel, I think you mentioned the question around reparations. And as we know, in the United States, African Americans have, this has been on the agenda for decades now, about paying compensation for the violence of slavery. So I just wanted to know whether there were any academics, scholars who were doing any work on the actual calculations for reparations, specifically from former colonial powers, paying back what is due to the countries from which they stole, pillaged, etc. And especially because we know that if reparations in its fullest form was to be executed, it would effectively result in the demise of the West, financially, economically, everything else. So I'm just wondering if there are any kind of scholars that you can point to, or any work that you can direct us to where this has already been kind of happening. It would be great to hear. Thanks.
Who would like to take that for our speakers?
Honestly, I think it's a really great question. I haven't come across any scholars who are specifically focused on the reparations agenda, but you've actually given me a challenge. So I'm going to go look for those scholars who are working on reparations in terms of actually quantifying what that would look like. But maybe other panelists have come across scholars who specifically focus on the reparations agenda.
I think Robbie Shalem, I don't know off the top of my head scholars who've done it like a quantitative analysis around this, but I know Robbie Shalem, who's a scholar who used to be at Queen Mary, but is now at Johns Hopkins, does write about reparations or the possibility of reparations. And I think one of the things to remember about reparations as well is reparations, the discourse around reparations started as a grassroots movement. I mean, it was in communities where the most disadvantaged people were in different places in the global South and around the world. So I'm always a little bit skeptical about, narrowing the discussion about reparations as a conversation that takes place between governments or between large aid institutions. I think we really need to think about how those institutions can then kind of reproduce violence and injustice against people, and who else perhaps needs to be involved in those conversations, or how like the transfer of reparations can be made to community organizations or to other actors that are fundamental in kind of local development as well.
Yeah, as Althea was talking, I was thinking about, I don't know if many people are familiar with the World Conference Against Racism that was held in 2001. There's a whole archive of material on reparations. I mean, that was one of the major agendas, but it got completely sidetracked when the US government decided to pull out because there were conversations around reparations for slavery. So there's a whole archive of a body of knowledge and literature around reparations. So I would encourage you to go back to that if you can access it. I'm sure it's online.
Okay, that's great. So, Shireen, that's the last question.
Thank you very much, Claire. We've let everyone know that we do need to wrap up now. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I'm sorry, I know I'm conscious of time and we've gone a bit over, and it's my duty as chair, I've kind of failed us, but the conversation was so important and so interesting. I want to thank you three speakers. You've done an amazing job of bringing us to a different place. I mean, Althea, you took us, you very neatly identified kind of racialized anxieties. We all look away, we can't confront them ourselves, and the loud silence that it's perpetrated. And then we move on to Robtel, who's brought us to the white gaze and the violence that is perpetrated on Black bodies. And Kalpana, you very adroitly and beautifully sort of outlined these institutional bodies that are just perpetrating this. And all three of you are really talking about a revolution. And I think that certainly we need a research revolution in any way. And, change is happening. It's very glacial. It needs to change much faster. And so, the new order that you talked about, Kalpana, we need to get there. We need to decide the new world we want, and then we need to go there. And I think that you three will help take us there. So I'm very, very pleased that you had the time to take part in this. And, thank you so much for your efforts and your time. And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us on this. And I hope that this is the very first of our conversation and we have an awful long way to go. So thank you.